Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Marco Perduca and I coordinate Science for Democracy, and welcome everybody to this webinar, the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, 60 years of an epic fail. Buongiorno, benvenuti per chi ci segue e vuole seguire in italiano nello schermo.
Good afternoon and welcome. For those who want to follow the webinar in Italian, you will find in the Zoom screen interpretation. You can choose Italian.
Speakers that have joined us from all over the world. I would like to thank the organizations that made this event possible. It's a long list. They're all Italian, with the exception of Science for Democracy, and they are A Buon Diritto, Antigone, Arci, CGL, CILD, CNCA, Comunità di San Benedetto al Porto, ENCOD, Forum Droghe, ITANPUT, ITARD, L'Altro Diritto, la Società della Ragione, Lega Coop Sociale, Legalizziamo, Associazione Luca Coscioni, Lila, e Meglio Legale. Today, we will mark the adoption of the first UN convention, which is the beginning of the modern era's international system of drug control. And I thought that perhaps the best way to open today's recommendation is to read from the introduction of the recently issued INCB, International Narcotic Control Board report, which is the usual mixture of good and bad news. There's a paragraph that runs under the title "Effective Drug Control as a Means of Fostering Peace and Security," no less. Under the pretext of the war on drugs, policies in some countries have led to disproportionate and overly repressive responses without respect for due process and the rule of law. Such responses have contributed to an increase in violence and related death rates. In its 2020 report, the INCB highlights that states should implement a comprehensive, integrated, and balanced approach in drug-related responses. Approaches should be based on principles of proportionality when determining penalties, shared responsibility, and respect for human rights, liberties, and the rule of law to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, in particular Goal 16, which is promoting peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development. States are encouraged to address the links between drug-related crimes and other forms of organized crimes, including money laundering, corruption, and other criminal activities in line with the International Drug Control and Crime and Counterterrorism Convention. Today, we will address all of these issues from the non-governmental perspective by people, experts, scientists that have been engaged in this field for the last 30-odd years, and that have been working not only as non-state actors, but also as elected officials or members of the international organization. I should like to take this opportunity also to thank the representatives of the mission of Chile, the Czech Republic, Canada, Afghanistan, Belarus, Turkey, Russia, posted to the UN in Vienna for their presence here. We had 350 people registered for the event. 100 are already following us in this Zoom room, and many more will be following us on our Facebook, internet accounts, but you can share the Facebook page of this live stream from the page of Science for Democracy so that your friends and colleagues will follow you. Let's start with Grazia Zuffa, who's the chair of La Società della Ragione. Grazia, you have the floor. Turn on. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Ho preparato il mio intervento in italiano avendo capito
I have prepared my speech in Italian because there's a simultaneous translation. Is that correct? Yes. My topic is the convention, the UN convention, and an update on the conventions from the viewpoint of non-governmental organizations. The first remark I have, there's no sound. Unfortunately, it's not possible to translate if there's no sound.
Diciamo 1909 con la prima commissione internazionale sull'oppio, che già aveva una
The
precisa.
first International Commission on Opium had a precise goal. Unfortunately, the sound comes and goes, so it's not possible to translate the speaker.
Grazie. Grazie, ti abbiamo perso.
We actually lost the speaker. I mean, there's no sound from the speaker.
La dimensione locale. C'è un problema?
Ora no.
La prima domanda che dobbiamo farci è se questa non sia
question we should ask is whether there is an original sin, an original abnormality that has consequences even today. First of all, with respect to drug itself, because psychoactive substances have an important social impact. They are part of social traditions in certain countries, so they are part of social prescriptions, social control. If we think to the Western societies, if we think about alcohol, this is very clear because alcoholic substances are criminalized. But in some countries and in other countries, they're regulated differently. So the sound is off again. We're very sorry, but the sound is gone again.
Però una dimensione internazionale di coordinamento e armonizzazione.
We need international coordination and harmonization in terms of policies. The moderator is saying, we're very sorry, but we can't hear you.
But I think we're having some connection problems, at least in Italian. I don't know if the English translation was better, but prova ad andare avanti, se no magari passiamo a Martin e miglioriamo la tua collezione.
I once again, otherwise we move to Martin and then, no, I'm afraid it's a connection problem due to my mobile. I have a very poor connection. My second remark is that democratic tools are in the hands of states and not at a supranational level. And so it is in the hands of superpowers. And generally speaking, in the beginning, the tools used by the United Nations basically promoted rights. For instance, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Millennium Development Goals, and they are not strong, binding legal tools. The second remark I have is that historically, the evolution of treaties moved towards an escalation of law enforcement response. In the beginning, the aim was to try and regulate markets. The Convention of 1961 is the foundation of total prohibition for opium, cocaine, and cannabis, which were the most popular drugs at the time in 1961. but it was a step forward because the cultivation was prohibited, and this escalation moved on with the Convention of 1971 that extended the number of substances, and then with the Convention of 1988, the drug issue was militarized, and the possession for personal use of drugs was criminalized. It is true that despite this escalation in conventions, policies have evolved along their own course. They were developed in Europe, and not only in Europe, but the mild policies developed with the 4 pillars policies, and with an attempt to sort of rebalance the criminal pillar with more emphasis on the social pillar. So, for instance, the 1988 Convention tried to decriminalize and avoid to impose a detention for minor crimes, minor offenses. In the 2016 Ungass, there was a clear debate between supporters of mild policies and supporters of the tough approach. Then the divide increased because some countries legalized cannabis, and there are very many of them actually. And they interpreted the conventions differently, and they referred more to the protection of health than to other principles. And so they tried to bring the drug policies back to the national level. So they tried to enlarge and extend national competence in this field. So the question we should ask ourselves as non-governmental organizations is what and if should be the commitment with respect to international conventions. There are some people who claim that conventions that are really old now. The last one dates back to 1988, half a century ago. So some claim that conventions are similar to rituals of the Church of Prohibition, and they are no longer valid and they are no longer used, and so they will slowly fade away. And so maybe it's worth starting a new process that it's certainly full of obstacles, but it might be worth starting a new process of regulating this issue again. On the other hand, the international community becomes more and more relevant because of globalization, and the global dimension becomes more and more important in policy making. But the problem is whether or not we can try and correct and adjust the historical approach of those international conventions and update it. In other words, is it possible to reform the conventions? Or should we follow another course internationally and leave aside the conventions? We should also ponder over the fact that the goal of international conventions that is continually revised and renewed in international meetings, that is reduction to the eradication of drug consumption. Well, we should also consider the fact that this is a totally different goal from public health policy or goal. I appreciate the four pillars approach and the balancing among different pillars of the policies, but we also have to consider that these are two totally different goals. The eradication of a drug consumption falls within the moral or ethical model. And in terms of public health, that considers the person not only biologically, but also as a whole, as a psychosocial being, a person that lives within a context of social relations. Well, with this approach, the goal is to try and curb the most dangerous patterns of consumption of drugs. So to try and have public policies that promote a more moderate use of drugs in order to protect health. So these are two different frameworks and they're totally different. That was what I wanted to say. Apologies for my very bad connection. I'm sorry.
I think, yes, these last two points are what has been at the center of a lot of critique, and unfortunately the daily so-called war on drugs. On the one hand, helping people with a medical problem, and on the other hand, trying to limit the damage that some of those substances might have caused to individual and public health when diverted from the medical arena to the non-medical arena. And I think this is something on which a lot of the people that will speak later today have information and experience to share. The next one on the list is Martin Jelzman, who's the Program Director of Drugs and Democracy of the Transnational Institute, TNI. You have the floor.
Thank you, Marco, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. Of course, it's one of my favorite topics, the UN treaty system. I've been looking into it quite in detail and for almost 2.5 decades by now. So it's definitely time for things to move forward. And in my intervention, I want to raise 3 points. Now, first, briefly, what was the purpose of the single convention, and to what extent has it accomplished something, or has it all been just a waste of time? Secondly, what are the main problems with that treaty and also the treaty system, so in combination with the other two? And finally, and I guess that's the main point also for discussion during this meeting today, basically the question that Grazia just posed: is there a way to reform these treaties, or what should be the path forward? And in that sense, Grazia, thanks for your introduction, because that is a good, that leads good into the points that I wanted to make. So first, what was the single convention meant to accomplish? Now, it had a dual purpose. On the one side, the idea was to ensure the availability of narcotic drugs for medical and scientific purposes. At the same time, prevent their diversion, the diversion from the licit production sources into the illicit market for non-medical purposes. The basic idea behind it was quite simple, and it built onwards on the pre-war treaties. There were several treaties already before the Second World War, and this one was meant to replace those ones, but several elements were taken over. So the basic idea was to estimate and record how much is needed worldwide of these drugs for medical purposes, and limit the production and the international trade to those quantities that are given by all the signatories of the treaties. And then, of course, anyone who cheats who produces more or sends something to a country that hasn't signed an import certificate, anyone who cheats that system will be punished. That was the basic idea. So there were two, I would say, inherent design flaws in the treaty. First, there were very detailed control measures and a detailed administration system. It's still today operating and maintained by the INCB. Very detailed to prevent the diversion via international trade from the licit production in one country to the illicit market in another. And that part of the treaty, in fact, worked quite well. But one of the design flaws was that no similarly detailed measures were included on how to guarantee the availability for medical purposes and how to make sure that the estimates provided also covered the real needs for medical use of a population. So the whole system, because of that design flaw, tilted towards one side of the coin. And drug control authorities that had to implement the treaty, of course, preferred to stay on the safe side. So the priority became to prevent the diversion and to punish the ones who used or traded drugs for non-medical purposes. And the consequence of that was that the availability for medical use, in fact, was severely affected. And hence, the pandemic of untreated pain, as someone has called it, the lack of access for a large part of the world population to these essential controlled medicines. The second design flaw was the over-focus on supply reduction measures, based on the belief that if the leakage from the pharmaceutical industry to the illicit market could be stopped, then the non-medical use of these drugs would basically dry out because they would no longer be available. The system did not anticipate that the supply for the non-medical use would simply be replaced by illicit production. And nowadays that may be difficult to imagine, but until the single convention got into force, the bulk of the heroin and cocaine on the market, in the illicit market, came from legal pharmaceutical sources. And the single convention was not designed to deal with the rapidly growing illegal production. That's also why later the 88 convention was added. And that's basically after the 88 convention, that's when the war on drugs really starts to escalate. The military are called in to help. Mass incarceration really takes off. All, of course, as we know today, still without having much effect on reducing the illegal market. So what are the main problems with this system and with the single convention in particular? Apart from these design flaws that I mentioned, one of the big problems with the single convention is that the treaty extended control to the level of plants and cultivation, while the earlier treaties focused on the extraction, the manufacture of preparations and the international trade. This is also where the colonial history comes in. Now, most of the colonies had centuries of traditional uses of these plants, and as long as the European colonial powers occupied those countries, they could make a lot of profits from allowing those practices to continue and to supply them through a colonial monopoly. The single convention was negotiated in the midst of liberation struggles, and after losing their colonial monopolies, Europe was more willing to give in to US pressure to implement a more prohibitionist regime at the global level. And that's how the treaty came to condemn ancient cultures to extinction, allowing still a grace period of 15 years for opium and 25 years for coca and cannabis. But the prohibition of these traditional uses, it's a combination of social, ceremonial, medicinal practices, today I would say represents the most glaring violation of cultural and indigenous rights that are embedded in a UN treaty, and that violation needs to be repaired. The second major problem is the zero tolerance nature that lies at the core of the treaty. Now, plants are treated the same as extracted and concentrated alkaloids. There's no such thing as a distinction between soft and hard drugs in spite of the 4 different schedules. Coca and cocaine are in the same schedule. Opium and fentanyl are in the same schedule, as are hashish and butane hash oil with 90% THC. And this has made it so difficult for countries to design more flexible and pragmatic harm reduction policies where levels of control for different drugs vary according to their relative health risks, and where certain tolerance can be maintained for less problematic substances and less problematic patterns of use. And thirdly, and that's maybe the obvious one, no, of course there is the fundamental problem with the treaty, with its punitive nature more in general, and the obligation to establish as criminal offenses any unlicensed cultivation, trade and possession, only leaving some room for maneuver on the side of drug use. It also states already now that serious offenses shall be liable to adequate punishment, particularly by imprisonment. So while the single convention still left some escape options open, based on constitutional principles, etc., now those loopholes were later in part closed by the 88 Convention, but already the 61 Convention sets the path of this very punitive model, criminal justice, criminal offenses, and incarceration, imprisonment as an explicit tool to use to curb the drug market. So, looking at all these problems, what can we do? Now, after decades of testing the limits of the treaty flexibility around the decriminalization, harm reduction policies, now these past years, the first countries have started to step outside of the space that can legitimately be defended on the basis of a treaty interpretation. State-sanctioned legal regulation of non-medical adult use of cannabis is clearly in breach of a number of treaty provisions. And the courage of countries, especially Uruguay and Canada, but also Mexico very soon, and several others in preparation, that courage is something to applaud. Because cannabis never belonged in this treaty in the first place. But as said, there are enough other problems with the current drug control treaties to justify breaches, if legal regulation indeed offers better prospects for health protection and social justice. Also, the advantage is that there is so much going on with legal regulation within the US itself, that the US can no longer play the role of the global police, in the case of cannabis at least. Also, from the UN side, blue helmets have not been sent to Uruguay or Canada. So what is the big deal? Can we not simply ignore or withdraw from these treaties? The argument against taking a position, a too easy position to ignore them or just hope that they will fade out over time, the argument is rooted in the importance of upholding certain respect for international law, because we don't want other countries to simply start ignoring other treaties that they have signed. And international law is not an a la carte menu where you can easily pick and choose. A country that clearly violates a UN treaty, like this one, loses the legitimacy to hold other countries to account. when those violate other UN treaties in the area of human rights, for example. And especially for less powerful countries, the international rule of law provides protection, and often the only protection against the world's superpowers that they have. So undermining that respect for international law more in general by ignoring a signed treaty or by inventing overly flexible interpretations out of thin air for political convenience has consequences also in other policy areas. But that said, of course, bad laws or bad treaties do not deserve respect and need to be changed. And often they first need to be broken or breached before they can change. And building up the legal tension by more countries joining the cannabis regulation trend, which is happening as we speak, is therefore a positive thing. But at the same time, out of respect for international law principles, the countries in breach do need to come up with a viable scenario to resolve the legal conflict between their domestic policies and their international obligations. And that is easier said than done. The opposition against any change in the current treaty system is strong, is organized. The situation in Vienna around the treaty issue, around cannabis, is very polarized at the moment. The consensus is broken. So the idea that, which in principle would be a great idea, to just, because of all these problems, because of the inconsistencies also between the 61 and the 71 and the 88 convention, the best solution would be to start from scratch and start talking about a new single convention to replace the current three ones. And yeah, update them, modernize the whole system based on all the new evidence that we have learned and obtained in the past decades. The problem is that to even think of convening a conference to start that kind of negotiation is a political nightmare, because it would lead to nowhere. The situation is too polarized, and no good new consensus could be found. So even amendments, even smaller amendments in the current treaty system would be very difficult to negotiate in Vienna. There's been the example recently of the WHO review of cannabis, to look at it again, suggest changes in the scheduling system, but and that does not require consensus. No? A simple majority vote of the CND is sufficient to approve it. And one of the recommendations was in fact voted in favor. And a crucial one, to take cannabis out of Schedule 4. But it also, the whole process demonstrated that, how polarized the situation is, and that for thinking of legal regulation of cannabis market for non-medical purposes, the scheduling procedure will also not give a solution. So that reduces the options basically to what Bolivia did for the coca. They withdrew from the treaty and then rejoined with a new reservation, basically saying that the provisions specifically about coca leaf are no longer accepted by Bolivia. And something similar could be done in the case of cannabis. But a more elegant possibility, and that may be something to talk about in the discussion, but it's something that we have been working on with a group of international lawyers. Now, there is the option in the Vienna Convention of the Law on Treaties to have sort of a joint reservation. So a group of countries can come together and agree among themselves to modify certain treaty provisions only for the relations among the countries signing up to this, what is called an inter-se agreement. And that could, I think, yeah, that would be an option to seriously consider. Also because it could be the start of the elements, a discussion of a possible new treaty regime or a new single convention over time, that more and more countries would join this mini treaty among like-minded countries, and it could slowly expand and also in terms of themes grow beyond the cannabis issue. So just to conclude, I would like to give one other quote from the INCB. Marco Peruca already gave one quote from the recent INCB annual report. I would like to give a quote which is relevant for this issue from the supplement to the annual report, because they had a special supplement which was also recently published on also the anniversary of the 61 and the 71 convention, so the topic of this very conference. And in the foreword, it says, the INCB considers that the current system is critically important in addressing the old and new challenges of the world drug problem, but at the same time calls for reflection on possible alternative and additional agreements, instruments and forms of cooperation to respond to the changing nature and magnitude of the global drug problem. And I see that definitely as a sign that even the INCB is opening up to, looking at possible scenarios for the future. And I'm also looking forward in that regard to hear from Francisco Toomey, who of course has been a board member, whether this indeed is a sign that the board is opening up to also challenging some parts of the outdated system. And I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Martin. It's for the overarching and comprehensive presentation, also in historical terms, and it's complex, to a certain extent complicated, but in the making. In fact, as we speak, the New York State Assembly is voting on a new law on marijuana, and possibly later today we will be in a position also to give some updates on that. Let's move on to another part of our debate, which is the impact of global drug policies. The first speaker would be Marie Nouget, who's the head of research and communications of the International Drug Policy Consortium, IDPC, and she will speak looking back at the past 5 years of Ungass implementation, what we have achieved. I'm also happy to say that we have within this room and all the other social channels over 300 people following us, so we thank them and we invite them to stay for the next 90 minutes. Marie, you have the floor.
Thanks so much, Marco. And thanks a lot to Forum Drug and all the organizers for organizing this great event. It's really timely and so important to have this discussion now. And I'm really grateful to be part of it. So as Marco said, I work for the International Drug Policy Consortium, or IDPC. For those who don't know IDPC, we are a global network of over 190 NGOs that come together to promote drug policies that advance social justice and human rights. So today we're discussing the 60th anniversary of the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. But 2021 also marks the 5-year anniversary of the Ungass on drugs. So the Ungass is a UN General Assembly special session. And this is a significant anniversary because the 2016 Ungass was a watershed moment in international drug policy. And this is mostly because it came about in a political context that fundamentally questions the punitive drug control regime that Martin has so well explained, and that has been established by the 1961 Single Convention and the 1971 and 1988 conventions that followed. So the Ungass itself had been called for by 3 presidents from Latin America. And this is a region that had borne the brunt of repressive drug control and its impacts on violence and human rights abuses in particular. And of course, the Ungass did not deliver all that we wished for at the time, but it was an important moment for the drug policy reform movement. More than ever before, health, human rights, and development were highlighted as fundamental elements of global drug policy in 2016, and that was a very significant thing, considering how punitive and repressive the approach was before that. The role of UN agencies focusing on human rights, health, development, gender, peace building, and others was also more prominent than ever before in UN debates on drugs. And as for civil society participation, the civil society voice calling for reforms was louder and more diverse than ever. So now, fast forwarding 5 years after the Ungass took place, what progress has been made in terms of the implementation of the Ungass and its outcome document? And what kind of impact does the international drug control regime continue to have for communities on the ground, good and bad? And this is really what we wanted to get at here. So as usual, there has been no official evaluation of Ungass progress so far. So IDPC decided to conduct our own analysis using data and research from the UN, from academia, but also from civil society and the community. And the report that we produced focuses on 6 critical areas: public health, development, human rights, civil society engagement, UN agency collaboration and cooperation, and drug policy evaluation. So the report actually hasn't been released yet. We're planning on launching it at the opening of the 64th session of the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, which is starting on the 12th of April. So this is really just a teaser of the main findings of the report. Our research shows that over the past 5 years, progress has been made on several aspects of global drug policy. For example, many governments in UN forums on drugs have moved away from a pure eradication language and towards a sustainable development approach to drug policy. Another major win since the Ungass is the level of visibility and feeling of urgency that has been given to the need to address the vulnerabilities faced by women in drug policy. And finally, the UN debates on drugs are no longer separated from the debates related to human rights, health, gender, and development. They're much more integrated now than before. And the adoption of the UN system common position on drugs has been a significant milestone in promoting more coherence in the UN family on drug policy issues. The common position was adopted in November 2018, and I encourage you to have a look at it because it really is an important document going forward, and it was adopted by all heads of UN agencies. And the same goes for the international guidelines on human rights and drug policy. These are the first of their kind, and I know that Rebecca is going to talk about them a bit later today. At national level, more jurisdictions have decriminalized drug use, including Antigua and Barbuda, Belize, Ghana, South Africa, and various US states since 2016. More states have also adopted medicinal cannabis schemes, including Bolivia, Denmark, Mexico, Peru, Slovenia, South Africa, and also South Korea and Thailand. And finally, harm reduction services have expanded, in particular in sub-Saharan Africa. However, what we have seen from available data and testimonies from the ground is that meaningful change for communities affected by punitive drug control has yet to materialize. Access to harm reduction and treatment services remains unjustifiably restricted, with only very limited progress in availability and access, especially for specifically vulnerable groups, which include women, youth, ethnic minorities, and the LGBTQ+ community. And some countries which had harm reduction services available in 2016 have actually closed them down. And this is the case, for example, in Brazil, in Bulgaria, Romania, and the Philippines. In addition to that, billions of people around the world in need are denied access to essential medications for the treatment of pain and palliative care. This is something that Martin has mentioned already. And in terms of drug dependence treatment, it's only available to around 1 in 8 people who need it, which is really concerning. People who use drugs continue to be criminalized in 85% of countries around the world, despite progress made in decriminalization. And at least 550,000 people currently in prison have been sentenced for a drug offense related to drug use. More generally speaking, people continue to be incarcerated in overcrowded prisons for disproportionate amounts of time for non-violent drug offenses. And it's estimated that 2.5 million people in prison worldwide are sentenced to drug offenses. This represents 1 in 5 people deprived of liberty. Women are women are disproportionately affected. The women incarcerated for drug offenses globally represent 35% of the total female prison population. And this proportion reaches 50 to 80% when you look in various Latin American and Asian countries. So this has a significant impact on people's lives. Hundreds of thousands of people are detained against their will in compulsory drug detention centers, but also in private rehabilitation clinics where they suffer humiliations, ill treatment, and forced labor. People suspected of drug offenses are also victims of police abuse, extrajudicial killings, as is the case in the Philippines, but also in Mexico, and they face the death penalty in at least 35 jurisdictions worldwide. Currently, there are at least 3,000 people on death row for drug offenses. There is increasing evidence that drug law enforcement specifically targets groups in situations of vulnerability, and that includes women, youth, the LGBTQ+ population, indigenous peoples, and ethnic minorities. And just an example for the latter, in the United States, although Black people represent only 13% of the US population, and levels of drug use are similar between Black and white communities, Black people comprise 40% of those incarcerated for drug offenses in state and federal prisons. And it's not just the case of the US. In Brazil, for example, 64% of people incarcerated are Black. In other parts of the world, farmers cultivating illegal plants continue to face forced eradication, health harms caused by the use of chemicals, violence at the hands of law enforcement and military forces, and they find themselves in situations of poverty and marginalization without any state support. This is the case, for example, in Colombia, which had showed significant promise for change with the signature of the peace agreement in 2016, but which recently turned back to a war on drugs approach with devastating impacts for people on the ground, including civil unrest, violence, and deaths of human rights defenders. In parallel with all that, civil society space has become increasingly restricted at both national and international levels, while the meaningful involvement of people most affected remains hampered by criminalization and stigmatization. In many respects, the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated this already dire situation. But it's also been an opportunity for civil society to clearly highlight the need for urgent reforms. So on balance, the positive reforms that have been observed in some countries and jurisdictions has not been able to counterbalance the lack of progress made in others, or the concerning moves that we are seeing towards even more repressive approaches in countries like Brazil, Colombia, Hungary, the Philippines, and Russia, just to name a few. This is mainly because the rationale promoted by the international drug control treaties remain one of prohibition and criminal justice responses, which has been quite well framed by Martin's intervention. So I will end here, and I encourage you all to read the report once it's been released on the 12th of April. The report also includes a number of recommendations for the next decade of drug policy, but this is perhaps something we can explore later in this webinar and in the Q&A. So thank you so much again for inviting me, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Marie. We do really hope that there's going to be a time to interact. There's already a question for Martin, so if he wants to prepare an answer, he can see in the Q&A session. The INCB this year has added another category to those that should be monitored when it comes to the implementation of drug policies or the problem related to drugs in the world, and that is the one of old people, people aged 65 and beyond, and people that have been living with this kind of habits for many, many years, perhaps for the last 30, if not 40 years. We have spoken a lot about the INCB. Our next speaker is Professor Francisco Tumi, former member of the INCB himself, and he's a professor of economics, and he's connected from the United States of America. And the title of his presentation is Will International Drug Policies Evolve from Simple to Complex, which is also a topic on which he has just written a book. Francisco, you have the floor, and please turn on the camera. Francisco. Can anybody hear me? So I would ask Francisco Tumi to turn on the camera. It's now his time. if Francisco has a problem and Rebecca is already with us, perhaps Rebecca. Okay, Francisco, microphone, please.
Yeah.
You have
Can
the
you
floor.
hear me now?
Much better. Yes.
Okay. Let me here. Share. Share. Okay. Screen sharing has failed. Okay. Okay. Anyway,
It worked before, so I think it
Yeah.
can work again. So try again.
okay. Yeah, I tried that, and well, anyway, let me start saying, in any case, that well, I'm not a member of the board, but I participated in the last years, and since I was by far the oldest member of the board, I was the one that promoted the last first chapter. Even though I left a year ago, I was pleased that the board agreed to have the chapter on all people. Now, the presentation I make here reflects my experience of 8 years at the board. The beginning was very frustrated. I mean, the third day that I was member of the board, I called Martin and said, look, I'm resigning. So he insisted that I should stay. Well, I stood. Now, what I found was a system that was designed, a very simple system that assumed that drug problems were simple and that a simple prohibitionary policy was sufficient. Of course, as Martin explained, it took 52 years of history and meetings and so on, so that until the 61 convention actually prohibited non-medical and scientific uses. Of course, the system was promoted by a particular group of people, religious, diplomats, lawyers, law enforcement enforcers, Western health professionals. And the policy was a top-down policy that was common in the world and still is common in authoritarian regimes. These conventions authorize governments to have stronger policies. By that means apply more force. Therefore, that allowed the justification for war on drugs and violations of human rights. There's no doubt that the system has a strong authoritarian bias. And there's no doubt either that countries with authoritarian governments and cultures don't have any problem complying with it and very happy with the system. I think that the consensus at the convention, yes, it's become weaker, as Martin said, but still the reforms cannot be, I don't believe that they can be applied using just the CND meetings and the UN General Assemblies. That's why I suggested another approach. What I did was to deconstruct the internal logic of the conventions. Because since I arrived there, it struck me that the conventions define many concepts, and the idea of what is medical and what is scientific purposes for the uses of drugs seemed to be something that everybody knew. The idea of health and the idea of welfare were also givens, and I'm afraid that those are very complex concepts that have to be defined. Now, the system pretended in the preface of the 61-71 convention that the purpose was to promote the health and welfare of humankind. However, in the Spanish and French versions is different. It's the physical and moral health, which confuses that pretension. However, all through the 100 years that we have, over 100 years that we have experienced with attempts at drug control, the real purpose has been to prohibit all social, experimental, ritual, and other human psychoactive drug uses. And that has led to the ultimate goal of a drug-free world, even though the UN agencies often recognize that it is unachievable. The lack of definitions of those concepts is what allows for a varying interpretation of the conventions, and they have varied in time and space. The case of marijuana is simple. It took the board 20 years. It was only in the 1995 report published in 1996 that the INCB told the Netherlands that they were not complying with the convention. The contrast with the behavior to Uruguay was quite clear. As soon as Uruguayan Congress started to discuss a possibility to legalize non-medical marijuana, the board started to put pressure on the government. And of course, it strongly complained after Uruguay enacted the experiment that they are having. Fortunately, within the board, there was no consensus about it, and the position has evolved. So now, referring to the Netherlands and Uruguay, the board simply says that, look, you are not complying with the convention, but please keep us informed about how you advance in those experiences. With human rights, there was also an evolution. From its establishment, the board argued that human rights were beyond its mandate because human rights were not mentioned in the drug conventions. And drugs, the INCB was not allowed to express any opinions about human rights. By the way, they forgot a small mention of the rights of native communities to chew coca that is in the '88 convention. But anyway, that's just a footnote. Now, in 2012, a few open-minded members were elected to the board, and it started to change its position on human rights in its 2014 annual report. I mean, today, the board position has been that drug policies should respect the human rights of all actors in the illegal drug chain, including peasants, traffickers, users, drug prisoners, money launderers, etc. It also insists that drug policy should have a gender approach so that it takes into account women. Then it also emphasizes that public health policies have to tolerate harm reduction. It is strongly opposes the death penalty, and it insists that public health, that the treatments to our users have always should be based on public health. Now, there's been another evolution that is subtle, and it's the fact that the drug agencies have adopted complexity. Basically, they argue that countries now tend to have diverse people with varying cultures and world visions, and that frequently they have different legal jurisdictions. It also argues that illegal drug trafficking is just a branch of the criminal industry that includes many more branches, including kidnappings, extortions, and so on. And that the illegal drug industry is encouraged with its development by all sorts of problems in societies like social discrimination, segregation, economic crisis, unemployment, and so on. And that those determine a degree of vulnerability that societies have to the development of organized crime. Now, adopting that narrative is one thing, but the challenge that it faces today, that the system faces, is the accepting the consequences of what they have written regarding complexity. Now, when one looks at the documents, they insist that still today, it's argued that the current policies are fit for purpose. That position, or at least the continuation of prohibition, has been justified on the unfounded assertion that the social costs generated by drug addictions are immeasurable. In other words, that no cost of illegal markets can be higher than the ones of prohibition. Now, however, they are willing to accept modern policy evaluation methods and argue that policies that support prohibition should be based on evidence. Ironically, they end up supporting evidence-based policies, but only in support of their fundamental non-evidence-based policy. That's why accepting the big problem today is to accept the consequences of complexity. First, once you accept the interrelation of many problems in society, one concludes that there is no direct causality among them, and that there's a lot of feedbacks into the problems, that they don't have unique solutions, and that those solutions are dependent on the social context in which they are applied. Solutions then should come from experimentation and innovation, and diversity should be accepted. Current drug policy science had agreed today that vertical policies cannot work except when the government and the culture are authoritarian. Developments in the social science after the conventions have really ratified and advanced a lot of things in the understanding of human behavior. I mean, the new knowledge offers the possibility of policies that respect and promote human rights and equality. Now, I have to conclude a simple modest proposal, which is not a specific proposal because there are no silver bullets, but that we need a change in the approach to formulate policies. And the big challenge is to modernize the international drug policy making through a process of co-creation of policies in which all stakeholders participate and cooperate in their success. You cannot have today in liberal countries successful policies without an integral bottoms-up approach. This will require to reinterpret the conventions and often open the possibility to reinterpret the conventions, expanded the definitions of health, medicine, science, and so on. I agree with Martin and also with Steve Rawls, whom I saw that also is listening, that their approach is interesting and is valid and should be tried. However, I think that my approach is complementary to what they have and that they should certainly be tried, at least. I concur with Martin in the issues that he raised about the fact that international law has to be respected, and that basically if there is experimentation, governments should be careful that they do not affect other countries as they propose, which is also in which we concur. Grazie mille.
Grazie, Francisco, to me. Thank you very much. I think we all are in favor of supporting and respecting international law as long as it protects and promotes human rights. And from what we have understood so far, there may be some problems here and there in the full implementation of the international drug policy control. And speaking of human rights and drug policies, it is a pleasure now to give the floor to Rebecca Schleifer, who's an international human rights consultant with extensive experience also within the UN system, and she is connected from Colombia. You have the floor, Rebecca.
Great, I'm just gonna share my screen. See if this works.
Yes, so it seems.
Okay, great.
There you go. If you could maximize it, it would be better so that everybody can see it.
Great. Great, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you all so much for, first of all, good afternoon, good morning, good evening. I know some people are joining from very far, all different time zones. Marco, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this webinar, and thank you all of you who are joining. As Marie mentioned, I'm going to talk about the international guidelines on human rights and drug policy. Some of you, many of you here helped to develop them and are instrumental in implementing them, so you know a little bit about them. I want to focus on three things: why guidelines, a little bit about the drafting process and the content, and then what's happening now with implementation. So, those drug conventions themselves don't mention human rights more than once. For more than 20 years, the various organs of the UN have stated that efforts to address the so-called world drug problem must be done in full conformity with human rights. But there's a lack of clarity as to what a rights-based approach to drug control means. So the international guidelines on human rights and drug policy are the result of a 3-year global participatory process to address this gap. And this is really the first time that human rights law has been applied to drug laws and politics in a comprehensive way. Many of you, and Marie, Martin, and Steve, were among the coalition of civil society actors that played a key role throughout the development and guidelines and now in their implementation. Individuals and communities most affected by drug control efforts, people who use and or cultivate drugs, and indigenous people, government and representatives of the UN, and regional health, human rights, and drug control entities also have contributed throughout to the development and now the implementation of the guidelines. So what do the guidelines cover? First, they cover a catalog of civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights, and they show how various aspects of drug laws and policies affect these rights. They address these key themes: criminal justice, public health, and development. And they also address specific groups: women, children, indigenous people, and people deprived of their liberty. And Marie spoke a little bit about the situation of women who use drugs, or involved in illicit drug trade, or dependent on illicit drug economies, who face distinct discrimination to men. This situation is compounded for women who are poor, indigenous, and members of racial or ethnic minorities. So, for example, in some countries, pregnant women who use drugs can be detained for the length of their pregnancy and are pressured to give up their newborn children. Some harm reduction and drug treatment services don't allow children inside, which means this effectively excludes many women who have children but don't have childcare. So the guidelines recognize that these situations threaten, among others, the right to access healthcare, to family life and freedom from arbitrary detention, and freedom from torture and other forms of ill treatment, and it gives specific recommendations about what government should do to address these problems. I just want to point out that these, of course, are not the only groups with specific human rights needs or concerns of relevance to drug policy, but they're emphasized as a consequence of more developed law concerning their specific human rights in relation to drug policy. And as Marie mentioned, many others also experience disproportionate harm, inequities, and intersecting forms of discrimination on grounds of race, ethnicity, nationality, migration status, disability, gender identity, sexual orientation, etc. So the guidelines aim to clarify how states can comply with their human rights obligations to protect and promote human rights and the rule of law, while taking into account their concurrent obligations under the International Drug Convention. And they just post states' positive obligations to take active measures to ensure human rights, and their negative obligations to refrain from actions that may violate human rights. And it's important to note that these guidelines are entirely based on existing human rights law. We thought that that was important so that states would take them up and not just say these go beyond what we can do under the drug control and human rights treaties, particularly the drug control treaties. So the guidelines don't invent new rights. They just apply existing human rights law to the legal and policy context of drug control in order to maximize human rights protections, including in the implementation and interpretation of the drug control conventions. It's also important to mention that we did this outside of UN processes. Why is that the case? Because we know that if we try to do this through UN processes, that would become a lowest common denominator. We all know the problems of trying to include certain states in interpretation of drug policy guidelines that has anything to do with human rights. But is based on sources that are binding or authoritative soft law. Also, clearly, the issues may differ depending on the jurisdiction, because no international document can address all of these. And this, I want to highlight, is where the expertise of civil society and people most affected by drug laws and policy comes in. First of all, using the guidelines as a way to quickly understand what human rights may be affected by a given issue, and also using the guidelines to enforce these rights and to advocate for law and policy reform to ensure their realization in practice. And I just want to give one short example of how the guidelines work. So they set out universal human rights standards in the context of drug policy, taking the rights in question as a starting point. So just as an example, over the past 15 years or maybe more, a robust body of law has developed regarding the obligation of states, that clearly states that withholding drugs for people who need them for medical purposes is considered a form of torture or ill treatment. So to comply, the guidelines therefore address key issues specific to access to pain relief and drug detention services. They make clear that to comply with the obligation to protect against torture and ill treatment, states should ensure access to essential medicines to treat drug dependence. That would be like buprenorphine and methadone to treat drug dependence, opioid dependence, or morphine to treat for pain treatment and palliative care. They also, as part of this obligation to protect against torture, must ensure access to harm reduction, drug dependence, and pain treatment in places of detention equivalent to those in the community. That includes not only prisons, but also so-called drug detention centers and where migrants are also being held. And they also have an obligation to monitor drug treatment practices. And the guidelines recognize the potential tensions between drug control and human rights obligations, some of which Martin and Dr. Toomey have mentioned in their interventions. The guidelines now have been translated into Portuguese, Russian, and Spanish, and we're about to publish commentaries citing to the sources that are the basis for the guidelines on an interactive website. I just want to move to the last point I want to make, which is that the most important parts, the guidelines are just a piece of paper. What's important is how they're used. And since their launch in 2019, they have been referenced in court cases, used by a tool to educate judges and prosecutors, and also used by civil society in drug law reform efforts. And just as one example, in 2019, the Colombian Constitutional Court used the guidelines twice to interpret cases regarding consumption and cultivation of drugs. First, the court used the guidelines to clarify state obligations to respect the rights of people who use drugs to consume drugs in public spaces. And in making this decision, the court referred to the guidelines on state obligations to ensure the right to evidence-based policymaking to guarantee the right to health of people who use drugs. The court also referred to guidelines on rights related to a healthy environment in its follow-up writ, ordering strict conditions on the use of the herbicide glyphosate to eradicate drug crops. And the court's decision that fumigation could not resume until strict requirements to protect the life, health, and environment of people who would be affected by fumigation reflected the guidelines. And most importantly, these out-Colombian human rights and drug policy advocates, those working with rural communities and harm reduction, it was important. These groups took the important step of calling attention to these guidelines to the court. In conclusion, I know that we're running short on time for questions, and I look forward to any questions or comments about how these guidelines can be given life to ensure that drug control practices really do conform with human rights obligations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. The first question would be, could you please post the link in the chat so that everybody can download the document, not the PowerPoint presentation, but the guidelines themselves that have been published?
This is the link and I'll publish it and right now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me just get out of the sharing situation here.
The guidelines were meant to be directed to institutions. We have someone that has spent some time with drug policy and law enforcement, who's Neil Woods, who's a more member of LEAP. I think LEAP UK. LEAP is the Law Enforcement Action Partnership. Neil, the microphone is for you.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak here today. There is such expertise on this panel today. I'm able to concentrate on something quite narrow that perhaps only a former police officer can really say. I'm from the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, so I'm on the board for LEAP in the USA, but also here in Europe. So with some of the things that I'm going to say, I am referring to the experiences and knowledge of police officers all over the world. And I'm also referring to information which is kept on police databases, criminal intelligence, which isn't normally in the public domain. So I suppose we have the advantage to be able to try and make that reality public. Now, I think I can perhaps describe to you all the experience of policing drug policy around the world with a short story. I used to work undercover, so my day-to-day job was catching drug dealers. That's what I did over the space of most of my career, actually, both in undercover work and in conventional policing. But my undercover work stretched between 1993 and 2007, so I did it for a long time. And I would travel around the UK, embedding myself into the city centre street drug consumer communities. And I would spend time manipulating the most vulnerable people in the streets, the most vulnerable people in our society. And the reason I manipulated the most vulnerable is because the most vulnerable are the easiest to manipulate. The truth of policing this war on drugs is that it encourages and develops ruthlessness within law enforcement. And I was certainly very, very ruthless. I was acutely aware of the harm that I was causing to these vulnerable people. I, on one occasion, ended up someone who I befriended, who I emotionally manipulated, ended up actually being suicidal when he found out that I was actually a police officer. So the cost of what I was doing was very real. But I justified to myself what I was doing because to me, as a police officer fighting this war on drugs, I believed that at the end of the operation, catching the drug dealers, catching the gangsters, meant that the end justified the means. And the end justifying the means is very much a theme in international drugs policing. So one operation I got involved in was against a rather infamous gang in the UK called the Berger Bar Boys. Now, a rather cute name sort of it doesn't really do justice to just how violent this gang was. They were using gang rape as part of their reputation building. They were doing the other kind of gangster things as well, kidnappings, maimings, those kind of things, but they were using sexual violence as just part of their reputation. So this was in the town of Northampton, and I spent 7 months manipulating vulnerable people, getting introductions to the gangsters, and I almost got killed a couple of times. I was stripped naked at gunpoint. But eventually, after 7 months, I gathered evidence of conspiracy against the 6 main gang members who were controlling the heroin and crack cocaine supply in that town. Plus, I gathered evidence against 90 other people. So there were 96 people arrested at the conclusion of that operation. And it was a huge logistical operation. It took police from 5 different counties to be involved. Huge amounts of people's doors kicked in the morning, lots of people arrested. And it was an extraordinary operation. But because after 7 months, I was sure that I had gathered evidence against every single person, that there was no new people to meet, there were no new phone numbers to get. I was sure I'd caught everybody. And so I was excited to think that on this occasion, the impact of this operation would be huge, that we would actually manage to shut down the entire drug supply in this town. Well, the police officer tasked with following the intelligence and keeping his ear to the ground spoke to me a week or so after the operation, and he says, yes, we managed to interrupt the heroin and crack cocaine supply for a full 2 hours. 7 months of work, hundreds of police involved for the sake of interrupting the drug supply for 2 hours. Now, I don't know for certain that it's the Berger Bar Boys' infamous rivals, the Johnson crew, which took up the opportunity that I'd created in that marketplace. I don't know for certain, but you can picture the scene, can't you? This gang hears what the police have done for them and they're jubilant, they're smiling. They put the order in and order lots more drugs, and they know they're going to make a fortune at this gap in the market created by the police. But of course, I didn't really see it that way then because I didn't understand. And truthfully, it took many years for me to understand. It took a long time for the penny to drop and for me to finally conclude that everything that I was doing was actually completely counterproductive. Because that short story about that operation against the Berger Bar Boys can actually be used to explain the efforts of drugs policing right across the world, because exactly the same thing is replicated at every single level of the market, whether it's on the streets of any city, whether it's the regional wholesale supply, or whether it's a national supply or international drug cartels. Wherever the police have what they consider a success, they always create a gap in the market. And the police are really, really good at catching drug dealers. They are. They're brilliant at it, but that's part of the problem. If you give the police twice the resources, they will catch twice as many drug dealers. But that is part of the problem, because wherever that gap in the market exists, there is competition to fill that space. And the police never reduce the size of the market, never, but they do change the shape of it. And the last 60 years of policing drugs has changed that market in genuinely horrific ways. Now, apart from the human rights abuses which is caused by policing, I certainly breach the human rights of vulnerable people on multiple occasions, routinely even. Apart from that, in the wake of police action, violence increases constantly. Monopolies grow. Organized crime has become much more efficient and military-like in response to the military development of policing. So if my role is anything today, it is to emphasize to all of you just how disastrous the current situation is. Now, I've heard mention from some of the previous speakers, Martin in particular, about the importance of the rule of law and the risks in breaching the single convention as individual nation states and the impact of that rule of law. Well, it might seem peculiar to some of you for the most radical person to speaking here as being a former police officer, but what I personally would like to see is revolution. I think from my perspective and the information that I'm privy to from international police intelligence is that the risk of the increased corruption from organized crime is a far greater risk to the future of international law than a breach or revolution, individual state revolution of these treaties would be. We are already seeing entire nation states being corrupted by international cartels, notably in West Africa. This is a catastrophe being played out. I can't find terms strong enough to state just how disastrous this is. Now, the problem we all have, and on this panel today, we have some of the most brilliant voices in drug policy reform around the world. We have the IDBC and Transform Drug Policy Foundation represented. But there isn't enough interest in the public to hear this expertise. The platform isn't there because the police control the narrative in the public debate. The public everywhere is being conned by what the police say, because it's not the police's fault. The police have a duty to maintain public confidence. So in their efforts with drug policing, they will tell the public that they are having successes. Now, if drug prohibition was a business, it would have the most successful marketing strategy in the history of business, because every single country around the world, you see repeated images. You see the images of doors being smashed in by the police. You see the images of the rows of mugshots of people who've been arrested. Most importantly, you see the photographs of seizures of drugs. Now, all of these images are a con, because drugs policing does not reduce crime. But the public, repeatedly seeing these images, are conned into believing that current policy works. So unless we collectively find ways to successfully challenge that narrative, we will not grow the social movement enough to bring change quickly enough. Now, I would just finish, because I apologize for going slightly over my time. I would finish to say that if any of you out there are planning an event, any engagement with media, journalists, politicians, please invite somebody from my organization, because we are the people who can challenge that police narrative, and we can add value to the work that you do by backing you up with the reality of what drugs policing means. So on that note, thank you very much.
Thank you, Neil. We have a few member states that are listening, so perhaps the message can go faster through their channels, but we will insist in having you invited as one of the speakers or any other member of LEAP. But we're running a little behind schedule, and we have taken another 15 minutes to add to the panel. So hopefully we will have time for Q&A. Now we move to reforms and struggle for alternative global policies, the agenda of civil society. The first speaker here is Anne Fordham, Executive Director of IDPC. And I also would like to thank now Michael and Kenzie that have decided to have just one of them taking the floor because of time constraint. Anna, you have the floor. Anne, sorry.
Thanks so much, Marco. Really thanks for the opportunity, and I'll try to be brief so we can make up some time. And also thank you to Grazia, who initially invited me to join this event and bringing us all together today. Just to say that in addition to the 60th anniversary of the 1961 convention, this year also marks the 50th anniversary of when Nixon declared the war on drugs. And incidentally, it's also the 40th anniversary since the first HIV AIDS case was noted and recorded. But I wanted to just say that regarding the 50 years anniversary of Nixon's so-called war on drugs, half a century ago, where, as we've listened to so many of the speakers who've come before me, so much devastation and damage has been caused at such a great cost, both in economic terms and in human terms, in the futile pursuit of ultimately a so-called drug-free society is just, so terrible. And I think what is clear is that the world cannot suffer another 50 years like the past 50 years. And momentum for reform continues to grow. So I think we should be optimistic that it will not take another 50 years to change drug policies and to end the war on drugs. I also just wanted to echo what Neil said, and I agree with him very strongly that one of the priorities from civil society, because that's what I'm asked to speak about, should be and is, but it's really difficult, and that's something we need to all work on together, is how we shift the narrative with the general public and persuade hearts and minds that this is such an urgent issue. And I think that there's much more work that we need to do there, because it is difficult to reach others outside of those who already agree with us. But that tent is growing. So just in terms of what we see as the kind of agenda for civil society, if you like, in this struggle for alternative policies, just reflecting back on IDPC also celebrates 15 years this year. We've been in existence for 15 years. And I think what's been really important over the last, few years recently is how social justice has become a central guiding principle for drug policy reform. And this is both to kind of right the wrongs, so to deal with the reparations from the war on drugs and, all of the terrible violations of human rights that have occurred. Marie outlined them in great detail: mass incarceration, arbitrary detention, the use of the death penalty, criminalization, forced eradication. So I think it's about social justice in reparations, but also looking forward and ensuring that the reforms that we see are coming, particularly at the moment vis-a-vis cannabis and maybe down the line with other substances too, that legal regulation does not further entrench inequalities, because we cannot allow the solutions that we've been fighting so far hard for to prioritize profit over people. This will simply reinforce the structural oppression that has been entrenched by the war on drugs. So it is really exciting that we're in this discussion about legal regulation, especially for cannabis, but we must advocate for cannabis markets that advance social justice, equity, and human rights. And I think a second priority for civil society will come as no surprise, is the continued push for strong human rights compliance and oversight. I think progress has been made in terms of the rhetoric and the global narrative that we see at the UN, at the CND, and also with greater engagement on drug policy issues from the UN human rights regime. So for example, the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention will release their first report on the issue of how drug control drives arbitrary detention this June at the Council. And there's been engagement from many other special procedures and treaty bodies, and that's been very welcome. It's been hard fought for by civil society. As also has previously been mentioned, you know, the INCB has come a long way in the last decade and has continued to make clear that drug policies must be implemented in line with human rights obligations. And they made a very strong statement on International Human Rights Day, for example, and the latest INCB report contains their strongest statements on human rights compliance to date. So that's really positive, but there's so much more to do. There is still an unmitigated human rights disaster happening all over the world in the name of drug control. So this huge chasm between the beautiful rhetoric and the reality on the ground requires our urgent attention. Moving on quickly to some immediate substantive priorities for drug policy reform, civil society. And I think it's very relevant in this, you know, marking the anniversary of the 1961 convention. I think as previously was mentioned, especially by Martin, you know, we must decolonize drug policies. I think in the past year, in particular, the struggle for racial justice has come strongly to the fore again, and the trial for the murder of George Floyd actually started just today. You know, from police brutality to the prohibition of substances traditionally used in many countries in the global south, such as cannabis, coca, and opium. You know, these connections between colonialism, racism, and drug policy are deep and complex, and never before has there been greater scrutiny to these intersections and a greater interest in understanding and unraveling the colonial roots of drug policy. And I think this, you know, renewed prominence of racial justice and indigenous rights also paves the way that for debates that, you know, previously in drug policy reform, we might have deemed too radical, such as discussions around defunding the police, around prison abolition and others. It's not clear what the answers are, but these are challenges for drug policy reform as I think, you know, we move forward and seek alternatives. And also this discussion is creating a very rich and deeper connections and solidarity between the drug policy reform movement and other movements such as the feminist movement and the abolitionist movement. You know, we've not really engaged in those discussions before, but we're starting to now. One other key priority, again, is really the push for decarceration. Marie gave some very harrowing statistics regarding mass incarceration. 2.5 million people globally are in prison for drug offenses. That doesn't include, by the way, administrative detention, such as people being held in compulsory drug detention. And the COVID pandemic really highlighted that states are unable to protect the life and health of people in prison. And raised many questions around the necessity of our incarceration systems. So at the outset of the pandemic, actually, we used the opportunity alongside many other organizations in the drug policy reform space and in system movements to advocate for the urgent reduction of prison populations. Decriminalization, I mean, finally to say, this continues to be a central priority for IDPC and for our members. In many parts of the world, people are still criminalized and punished for using drugs and possessing drugs for their personal use. The 2018 UN Common Position on Drug Policy makes an unequivocal call from the UN system to decriminalize drug use and possession for personal use. And, you know, this is really great that we have this, you know, sort of statement and clear position from the UN system. And also the UNAIDS recently, last week, in fact, adopted the new global AIDS strategy, which is also very strong on the need to remove punitive laws and policies. It actually has a target that by 2025, less than 10% of countries will have punitive laws and policies, including the criminalization of drug use. So it's very ambitious. And to this end, we'll be calling on countries to review their drug laws and policies, remove all punishments for drug use, possession for personal use, ensure proportionate penalties and sentencing practices, using meaningful alternatives to incarceration, with the goal of using prison only as the means of last resort. And finally, Of course, it's a priority for us as a civil society network to ensure civil society space remains open, that civil society are able to engage, make their voices heard. The importance of civil society and community voices in shifting this debate and this narrative over the last 2 decades, I think, cannot be understated. So I think we need to fight to keep those spaces open for civil society to engage and to participate. Thank you. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Anne. And it's too bad that the next CND, Commission on Narcotic Drugs, will be organized in a way in which, despite the fact that we will all be attending, or most of us will be attending via a Zoom room, they have also limited the amount of people that can in fact follow the debate, let alone taking the floor. Thank you very much once again. Michael Krawitz has said on behalf of 4 Alternative Approaches to Addiction, Think and Do Tech. You have the floor.
Boy, thank you. Thank you, Marco. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. It is really an honor to be here with such an esteemed group of colleagues, the many who I consider my mentors. I think before I talk, kind of on the subject, I just want to, short introduction is kind of in order, because most people don't really understand where we fit into this big picture. I was sent over to the United Nations back in 2007 by the leadership of the US cannabis movement. You probably know some of the names: Dennis Perone, Jack Herer, Chris Conrad. We had a big meeting behind the scenes, and I was elected to go to the UN. And I've done my best to represent the cannabis movement within the United Nations. For about the first 10 years, we worked on infrastructure, rebuilding the New York NGO Committee, working on building out the Vienna NGO Committee, culminating in the Beyond 2008 process, which I think is a very important milestone. And the documentation, the 2008, Beyond 2008 resolution, part of our required reading as NGOs participating in United Nations drug control activism, drug policy reform at the United Nations level. Working for the cannabis movement, we basically started working around 2009 on actual cannabis policy, leading to the 2015 breakthrough, where we were able to go over to Geneva and work for the next 5 years or so with the World Health Organization, leading to the milestone recommendations of the World Health Organization from its first ever cannabis review process within the treaty to make strong recommendations of, as Martin said, the strongest of which was accepted. Just to finish that thought, it normalizes cannabis as a medicine and allows for cannabis to be treated as a regular medicinal substance worldwide that's well within tolerable, negative consequences of use, and is certainly something that has accepted medical value and even further provides relief that other medications don't provide. So you could look at it as an incremental step, a very important background piece, correcting the evidence base of the treaty. There's a lot of different ways you can look at it. I come to you today, working in the field. We have a ball in play, you might say. Sorry about my allergies kicking in here. We have a ball in play in Vienna. The International Narcotics Control Board, recognizing the change in position of the World Health Organization, recognizing cannabis as a medicine, has embarked on guidelines for countries to find best practice on manufacturing, distribution, and even cultivation of cannabis for medicinal purposes and for scientific ends. We applaud this effort, but there are some serious problems with the approach, both from the perspective of it being basically a behind the scenes process that involved some industry, some governments, but was very non-transparent. And the process, furthermore, I think, and we think, Kenzie and I, it goes off the rails a little bit, with regard to this, the treatment of cannabis as a only as a set of cannabinoids for medicine instead of a plant that actually has traditional cannabis medicinal value. They're only looking at like derived pharmaceutical products as legitimate. They pretend that CBD and cannabis leaves are under control, which is clearly not the case. That we think they go far outside their mandate, even stepping into the FAO's turf, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. These guidelines are now in draft stage, and I believe they're going to be released next year at the commission. So this year at this Commission on Narcotic Drugs would be a very good time to intercede and to get involved if you want to pry into that process and help the International Narcotics Control Board not overstep their mandate and actually make a decent contribution to help member states in this regard. I want to just go back before I hand the microphone back to the big picture here for a minute. I think that it's really important for us to focus on one aspect that Martin was talking about, how the treaty essentially at a time when colonial powers were ready to wash their hands with many of the countries around the world that actually are the source countries for a lot of the cannabis and a lot of the plant material based drugs that are under control, coca, poppy, cannabis, the cornerstones of the treaty, so to speak, that these cultures were basically destroyed when these colonial powers were done with them. This International Narcotics Control Board guidelines should be seen in our eyes as a cautionary tale and a warning for everyone to be careful how we proceed here. We feel that there's a very strong moral obligation on behalf of USA to get out there and do its best to do exactly what Martin says, the heavy lift that we need to do, create a new treaty, a treaty that folds the three treaty agreements into one and fixes the inclusion criteria so that plants don't wind up in the web, gives countries the tools and ability to go whack-a-mole after these very dangerous new psychoactive substances that keep popping up that are extremely dangerous, but yet at the same time, eliminates these cultural and agricultural and other contradictions, human rights contradictions in the treaty, and be very careful about agreements amongst countries, interstate agreements and things like that. That is particularly where kind of this International Narcotics Control Board is heading. We feel already into a sort of pharmaceuticalization, big corporate power, almost neo-colonial interests being furthered. So be careful, that we don't, fall into another trap as we're getting out of this trap. And I'll finish with that. I think it's very important that we work on what needs to be done, even if it seems undoable. Bolivia, I think, did the right thing when they came in first and they tried to change the treaty. They knew they couldn't change the treaty, but they still tried to change the treaty and they put the resolution forward. And then they withdrew and reapplied, which is just like the WHO, just a simple vote. So, this is big picture stuff, and I really appreciate your time and thought on all this. Anything that I can do to help, please refer to our documentation on both the World Health Organization process, on ResearchGate. Kenzie and I are easy to find. And this International Narcotics Control Board, we went into very great detail on human rights aspects and other aspects of the report for everyone. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Steve Rolls, who's a senior policy analyst at Transform. I saw you. Yes, you have a lot of sun to be in the UK, so you're lucky.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you, Gracia, for inviting me to speak to it. Hello, everybody. Good evening, good morning, good night, wherever you are. I suppose the first thing I want to say is that there is a lot to be positive about. There is a lot of change happening, and the change is accelerating around the world. If you look back at previous years and previous decades, there's been remarkable reforms around harm reduction, which kind of was only invented in the 1980s, really, but has spread around the world. There's been a growing trend around decriminalization. Portugal gets a lot of attention, but Portugal is only one of maybe 25 or 30 countries that have decriminalized cannabis, or in many cases, all drugs. But for these big reforms, harm reduction and decriminalization, important and significant as they are both nominally allowable within the UN treaty system. They're controversial with many member states, but they are allowed within the treaty system. Legalization and regulation of any drugs, cannabis or any other drug, for non-medical and scientific use is very definitely not allowed within the treaties. As the UN drug agencies, like the INCB, are repeatedly reminding us, legalization is just a clear red line. Decriminalization you can do, legalization you can't do. But it is happening anyway. So you're not allowed to do it, but loads of people are doing it. And I think, this is most spectacular in terms of the pace and scale of reform with cannabis, obviously. As most of you know, if you look, almost the whole of North America now is either legalized cannabis or is about to legalize cannabis. If the MORE Act, which is currently in the US passed in Congress, it's now with the Senate, and was sponsored by the current vice president, and actually has some Republican backing as well. If the MORE Act passes, effectively the entire continent of North America will be a legal cannabis jurisdiction. When Mexico legalizes cannabis later this month, you will be able to walk or ride a bike or drive a car, however you like to travel, almost from the Arctic Circle in northern Canada, almost all the way to the equator, down the west coast of the continent. And that will be this year already, because the whole west coast of America is already a legal cannabis jurisdiction. We've seen Uruguay legalized. We've seen was the first member state back in 2014, I think it was. A number of other Latin American countries like Colombia are looking to follow Uruguay. We've seen a number of Caribbean countries are in the process of legalizing cannabis, including St. Lucia and Trinidad and Tobago. Legalization for religious use in Jamaica. Even Bermuda, kind of Caribbean, is looking at legalizing cannabis for non-medical uses. Non-medical use. Medical use is allowed within the treaties. Non-medical use, very much not allowed. And we're also seeing cannabis being legalized for non-medical use in Luxembourg. It came a bit out of the blue, a bit like Uruguay. Luxembourg will be the first EU country to formally legalize cannabis. It's been kind of quasi-legalization in the Netherlands for years, but Luxembourg is set to be the first country in the EU to formally legalize for non-medical use. And elsewhere in the EU, we're seeing all sorts of reforms. In Italy, as Marco and Grazia will tell you, because they've been leading a lot of it. In Spain, in Switzerland, in Denmark, in the Czech Republic, there are very high-profile parliamentary level debates going on now about legalizing cannabis for non-medical use. There was a referendum in New Zealand just last year, which lost, but only by a few thousand votes. And even in Africa, there was a constitutional court case in South Africa that declared cannabis prohibition unconstitutional on a human rights basis, and that is moving South Africa fairly rapidly towards a legally regulated market. So we've got well-developed moves or debates to legalize cannabis on every continent now, on every continent. And I haven't even described all of them. But collectively, this is a very potent symbol of the crumbling consensus around prohibition and the whole war on drugs paradigm, the whole war on drugs philosophy that treaties represent, or at least that one part of the treaties represent. But I think it's important to note that the reforms that are going on around the world actually go beyond cannabis, and I think it's worth noting these. For example, with psychedelics, psychedelic plants exist in quite an interesting space regarding the treaties, in that the treaties control the active drugs such as DMT and mescaline and psilocybin, but technically not the plants or plant material that those drugs are derived from. So plants such as the vine that ayahuasca is made from, or the cacti, San Pedro and peyote cactuses that contain mescaline, or the many psilocybin containing mushrooms that grow wild around the world, are not controlled by the conventions in the same way that cannabis, coca, and opium poppy are. Many of them are controlled at domestic level, but by the treaty, they're not technically controlled. They're kind of exempt, perhaps leaving some flexibility. And this may require a reservation for traditional use, but it may actually be possible for legal markets in some of these psychedelic plants to simply avoid the issue of treaty non-compliance. And that has happened, for example, in the Netherlands, where you can just buy psilocybin truffles in smart shops in Dutch cities or online. And even in the UK, my country, in 2003, for about 2 years, there was a legal magic mushroom market because we discovered a legal loophole. It was closed down later, but we had this brief moment. We actually imported them from the Netherlands. So thank you for that, Netherlands. And of course, this possible exemption doesn't apply to LSD or synthetic drugs. But the interesting thing with psychedelic plants is that we're beginning to see reform in that space. So in the US, in Oregon, the state of Oregon and Washington, DC, they have already in the last year effectively decriminalized the use of psychedelic plants. It's not legal, it's not a legalized market, but it's de facto decriminalization, perhaps setting the stage, as happened with cannabis in the US, for wider reforms around psychedelic plants, both in the US and potentially elsewhere in the world, because where the US does things, the rest of the world quite often follows, just because of their cultural and political status in the world. But it's not even just cannabis and psychedelics. As Michael mentioned, in Bolivia in 2013, they effectively legalized traditional use of the coca leaf, which contains the cocaine alkaloid, by leaving the treaty framework and then rejoining with a reservation on traditional use. We tried initially to reform the treaties, but failed. They left the treaties and they rejoined with a reservation on coca use, becoming effectively the first country to legalize any drug other than cannabis. And in many ways, the first real defection, the first real crack in the prohibitionist consensus in terms of the treaties. More recently still, we've seen the Supreme Court case in Mexico to legalize the use of cocaine. Although it only applies at the moment to 2 people, it may not seem like much, but it was a similar case in 2015 around cannabis that began a series of events that led to the legalization and regulation of cannabis, which will happen in Mexico later this month. And in Colombia, a bill to legalize and regulate both coca leaf and cocaine powder for non-medical use is currently being debated in the Colombian Senate. And I'm very proud to say that Transform did some work in terms of the design and content of that bill. And we've written a book about it, which you can read on our website if you're interested. Now, it's unlikely to pass, this Colombian cocaine bill, but nonetheless, the simple fact that the legalization of cocaine is being debated in the Colombian parliament is a powerful sign of how far the reform debate has come in terms of high-level political forums. So reforms are now happening on a continent for a range of drugs. It's not just about cannabis. Now, I want to read you a short quote from the Global Commission on Drugs, which they wrote in 2014. And I quote, "The strength of the UN treaty system is based on the consensus of support from member states and the legitimacy of its goals. For the drug control treaties, this consensus has fractured and their legitimacy is weakening owing to their negative consequences. More and more states are viewing the core punitive elements of the drug treaties as not merely inflexible, but outdated, counterproductive, and in urgent need of reform. If this growing dissent is not accommodated through a meaningful formal process to explore reform options, the drug treaty system risks becoming even more ineffectual and redundant as more reform-minded member states unilaterally opt to distance themselves from it. End of quote. Now that was written in 2014, so nearly 7 years ago, before many of the reforms I mentioned a moment ago even happened. It's clear that the tensions are only going to increase as more and more countries move outside of the treaty framework, in the letter or spirit of the treaty framework. Now, clearly, something has to give. Something's got to give. Even for the prohibitionist countries, even for the real hardcore war on drugs prohibitionist countries, a point will be reached where they have to accept some form of modernization or accept that the system will collapse into irrelevance, potentially threatening some of the elements on which a consensus still exists, such as the control over international trade in medicines, which Martin mentioned earlier. Now, what the path to reform will be, we don't know. It could be a new treaty, which includes some greater flexibility for regulation. It could be a series of amendments and modifications that play out over a number of years. Or it could be, and I hope it will be, the inter se treaty modification approach that Martin spoke about previously. But there are two things I want to emphasize before I finish. All of the reforms that I've mentioned shared a dynamic of being a bottom-up reform process. The change has been led by civil society, by individuals, and by, generally speaking, smaller jurisdictions, rarely by national governments and never by UN drug agencies. This has been true for the harm reduction innovations, such as needle exchanges or supervised consumption rooms or drug testing at festivals. It was always the little guys who started this, and it bubbled upwards. It was never leadership from the top. It's also been true for decriminalization. And we're beginning to see the same pattern for legalization and regulation of cannabis, and now increasingly other drugs as well. It's the small countries, the small jurisdictions, the municipalities. They're the ones showing the leadership. Those with the power, even those who agree with reform, are generally happy to delegate the leadership role and the political risks of reform to the smaller jurisdictions, to the municipalities, and to the courageous civil society organizations and individuals, many of whom you're listening to tonight. Then once a reform is shown to work and the public have been won over by being shown that it works, it will eventually be adopted at a national level, and then at a regional level, and eventually at the multilateral scale at the UN. But it can take a long time. UN lagged behind the pioneers of harm reduction. They lagged behind on decriminalization and of medical cannabis. But once they've formally adopted a position, they can do some very useful work in states that have yet to reform. But we have not seen, and I suspect we should not look to the UN, certainly not the UN drug agencies, for bold leadership on drug law reform. Perhaps some of the development agencies and the human rights agencies, but we are not going to see the INCB or the UNODC showing leadership on treaty reform or legalization and regulation. That's a betting certainty, is what we would say in the UK. So we now have legalization, particularly of cannabis, unfolding across the world. But all we have heard from the UN drug agencies is kind of naughty, naughty, you're very bad people, don't do that. Very little by the way of meaningful debate, and nothing in terms of best practice advice on regulation. That's exactly what the WHO does, and for the most part they do it very well, in terms of advising states on best practice for regulating alcohol and tobacco. But on cannabis and other drugs, nothing. Now, it's certainly true that as we move forward, member states will be stronger if they stand together behind the UN's common goals on health human rights and development. There is strength in numbers at the UN in political and practical terms, especially when small countries are bumping up against the big, powerful prohibitionist forces of Russia, China, and others. And what is true of member states is also true of civil society. Not only is it important that the drug policy reform groups work together constructively, but also that we are bringing together the movements for change. And this is Anne's point that she made so well. We bring together reform movements for change in drugs with movements for sustainable development and social justice. Because the war on drugs affects everybody and every dimension of social policy and social justice. And my final comment is that this really isn't the time to be complacent, even if we achieve local successes. The legalization of cannabis in Luxembourg, for example, means nothing to the thousands of people dying in drug war violence in Mexico or being subject to extrajudicial killings in the Philippines. And to quote the COVID statement, which I think is pertinent here, no one is safe until we're all safe. And I think I'll end there. Thanks very much, Marco. Sorry if I went on too.
No, that's no problem. Thank you very much, Steve. I will ask Susanna to turn on a camera. We only have one question. There's not going to be any debate. And if Martin is still with us, it's a very quick question. I think you can answer with a yes or a no. And thank you, Susanna, for your time. Martin, are you there? The question would be, here. Okay, what provisions exist in the single convention for naming and shaming countries which do not do enough for ensuring access to narcotic drugs for medical purpose?
Yeah, basically nothing now, because as I said, there are very precise minimum requirements in terms of criminalization and things that states have to do. But when it comes to ensuring availability of medicines, yeah, it's only a general obligation, but it isn't spelled out. So it's also very difficult to hold countries to account. So that can only be done basically on the basis of human rights arguments, the right to health, but not from within the drug treaties itself. The INCB has started to make, and the WHO as well, is calling on countries very strongly, to improve their performance on this particular issue. So they are calling on countries to improve their performance, but there's no possibility to sanction or punish any countries. Thanks.
Thank you. And the question was by Atul Ambekar. There's another question di qualcuno in italiano. Rispondiamo suggerendo di controllare sul sito di fuoriluogo.it Forum Droghe e Associazione Luca Coscioni, perché una delle cose che si possono fare per il problema che è stato
For the other questions, please go on our website, because another thing that we could do is to write to the government. So we have collected the signatures of 400 people who are on hunger strike. We wrote it to our Prime Minister and to the Health Minister. The floor to Susanna Ronconi now for the conclusion of this long afternoon together. Apologies for running late with our program. Then we'll close with greetings and thanks. I will speak in Italian, but we have a simultaneous translation. Drawing conclusions is really a mission impossible, but I want to first of all thank all the speakers, because it's really very rare to have such a high level exchange of opinions and facts and figures. I speak as a member of the Forum Droghe, so as a person who belongs to one of the international networks who try to stop this global system of drug control in order to make sure that the system is no longer just a criminalizing machine, because at the end of the day, this is what the conventions have created, a gigantic criminalizing machine against the users and producers of drugs. So I try to understand what is the latitude for action that we have. And this evening's exchange of ideas has once again stressed the complexity of the situation, and it does stress that it's difficult to change processes and models that are already in place. On the other hand, I come out of this meeting with some hope, because in the world and in the different societies, in different countries, things are changing rapidly and have done so in the last decade. And this is due to a lot of movements, also a lot of us, and civil society that is pushing to reform drug policies. The task ahead of us is to tell governments and international agencies that society has changed and is changing. We have to try and voice this. And very often this is difficult to do. The good news is that we are not in a stagnating situation. The flow is moving. There are currents, so to say, within and without the United States. So things have changed also in the documents and in the wording of official documents of these agencies. They start talking about the respect for human rights. They start talking about the need to measure the impact of policies. Also, decriminalization is being discussed, and also alternatives to incarceration. So we're not at a standstill. Things are moving. Within the United Nations, some interesting events occurred. Marie mentioned the closing document of Ungass 2016 that contains interesting novelties. I would like also to recall the common position signed by various UN agencies. It is an interesting document because it tries to bring within the drug policies the various languages and the various stances of the UN agencies, because we only consider the UN ODC that speaks in the language of law enforcement, but the other UN agencies speak a different language. They speak about sustainable development, human rights, and so on. So if within the United Nations there's an opening towards a different perspective, so to try and not consider drug policies just as prohibition and open up to other approaches, I believe that this is already something that is very interesting for us. And as movements and associations and civil society, we have to push that further. I'm under the impression that possible changes in global policies don't happen in the auditorium in Vienna or in the auditorium in New York. They actually take place also at national level. For instance, countries that legalize cannabis. This is a great breakthrough. And I think it's also interesting to see that there are no radical reactions by UN agencies about this legalization. So no one is kicked out of the conventions because they have legalized a drug or a substance. And I think this is very promising because it means that there is some flexibility within the conventions. Maybe there are some weak points as well. And here I would like to refer to what Martin said, that is to say, let's consider to what extent it is desirable to weaken the conventions. What I would like to stress is that certain innovations brought about by certain states has not been penalized, it's not been sanctioned. And once these experiments, these practices are brought into the United Nations process, we gain more space for those initiatives. I would like to close by saying that should we consider conventions as non-existent because governments can pass their own acts and bills, or should we instead try and push for the reform of conventions? It's an important question, I believe, that we should ponder over. And I will conclude by saying that on the basis of our policies, I do not wish for international movements to split into two different positions, some of them being in favor of conventions, reforms, and some of them being against it. I think that we should join forces and try to bring about a real and effective change that doesn't take a millennium to happen. We must not think that it will take 50 years to change things. That would be too long. We have probably to develop new strategies in order to speed up this process. This is my wish. Thank you. Thank you, Susanna Ronconi. For those who are following the Italian channel, the 20th of April is the Cannabis Day. The 20th of June is the day against drug trafficking. Then we will have other events and opportunities to make civil society's voice be heard by governments so that we can put forward suggestions for bills and acts. On behalf of Antigone Buondrit, NCA, Comunità San Benedetto, il Porto, Encod, Verdroghe, Itanpool, ITAR, Altro Diritto, Società della Regione, Lega Coop Sociale, Legalizziamo, Associazione Luca Coscioni, Lila, Science for Democracy.
For their presentations and proposals, we will certainly continue to promote other opportunities to talk and strategize together on these issues. And finally, let me thank our interpreters for the great work. I also had an opportunity to listen to part of the debate in another language. Thank you very, very, very much. And apologies for the accent and the speed and the delay. And Leonardo Fiorentini, who was one of the promoters of this event and has also allowed us to be streamed online. Michael Baraha, Jessica Sanson, and Matteo Mainardi for their technical support. A link to the panel will be emailed to all those that have registered for this webinar. Grazie. Arrivederci. Bye bye. Grazie mille a tutti, a tutte, anzi devo dire, scusate per il ritardo. Caffè pagato appena ci si vede. Doppio, dai. Bye bye.
Possiamo chiudere? Ditemi quando posso chiudere.
Sì, puoi chiudere.
Ok.
Ciao, grazie mille.
Ciao a voi.
E quindi termino proprio il webinar.
Sì.
Sì.
Ciao, grazie.
Ciao.
Ciao, grazie a voi. Ciao.